if you are being abused or have been abused, it's not because of something wrong with you. It's because of something incredibly right with you. You bring emotional strength. You bring spiritual and personal resource to the world. And everybody has benefited from that but you.
Hello, this is Gretchen Baskerville, and I'm the author of The Life-Saving Divorce, Hope for People Leaving Destructive Relationships. And today I'm interviewing Bob Hamp, who's a licensed marriage and family therapist. He's been practicing for 30 years. He's a Christian and the co-founder of Think Differently Academy, which just launched its own social media site. So go to tdacad.com. Today, we're going to talk about the dynamics of abuse. Welcome, Bob.
Oh, thanks, Gretchen. And I've got to say, I'm super excited to do this with you. You have been one of my heroes since we jumped into this on Twitter. I don't remember when I started reading your tweets about your book that hadn't been released at that point, but it's super exciting for me. I'm very honored to be here on your podcast.
Well, I know people in my private Facebook group, Life-Saving Divorce, say incredible things about you. And then I got to meet you finally face-to-face at the 2020 Reclaim conference that you and Polly put on. And then being part of the 2021 conference was just amazing for me. So anyway, you are a person who just does a great job on the topic of the dynamics of abuse, and especially emotional abuse. Would you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I want to say, I'm saying a little bit more every time, Gretchen. People ask, why I think the way that I think about this, and I have two answers. One of them is, I've always kind of looked at things from a slightly different viewpoint, hence why everything that we do is called Think Differently. But I've shared with you personally before that I also came out of a psychologically abusive marriage. And I generally don't talk about it much in public for a number of different reasons, but I also want people to know a lot of my learning and quite honestly, a shift for me happened 6 or 7 years ago as I started to really look and go, how was it that I got blindsided, and how was it that I got fooled in such a way that it took 6 counselors to convince me that I was in an abusive situation. And I just thought that they didn't understand.
6 counselors. Wow.
Yeah.
They all tried to get you to wake up to the fact that you were an abused spouse.
Mm-hmm.
Tell it, why is that?
Well, and that's one of the reasons why, like when it finally shifted for me, my eyes were finally opened when one of those counselors recommended that I read a book called The Betrayal Bond by Carnes. Strong recommendation, especially if you've been in more than one betrayal type relationship, more than one psychologically abusive relationship. I thought that counselor was giving me that book so that I could understand the trauma that my at that time spouse had been through. I really thought they were giving it to me so I could really help more support her. And quite honestly, that's a clue to how it was that not only was I fooled, but I began to realize that many, many people are fooled, both abuse victims and the onlookers into abuse are fooled by this idea that that the victim believes not that they're a victim, but rather that they're a specially qualified helper.
Specially qualified, like maybe the only person in the world who understands this person and what a diamond in the rough they are.
Yeah, I can see things no one else can. I can understand them in a way no one else can. And I've got this capacity to love them beyond, to love them out of their trap. And so when I began to read that book by Carnes, it was like the mirror turned around and I saw me instead of my spouse at that time. And when I saw me, it was like the whole horizon began to shift in front of my eyes. And I began to realize that I'd been looking at and through an optical illusion. And it was picking that stuff apart that made me realize, and here's to me the crux of the whole thing. And I would say this about every type of abuse. Every imaginable type of abuse has at its core, at its foundation, this one simple dynamic. And when I say it, people think it doesn't sound that insidious, but let me kind of expand on it for a couple of minutes. The one simple dynamic is this: At the core of all abuse is the misassignment of responsibility.
The misassignment of responsibility.
Misassignment of responsibility. See, it doesn't sound that bad, right?
No, no. Tell
Kids
us
do
about that.
together. Well, so let me illustrate it this way. Imagine, and I'm going to take what people, probably the most observable, concrete type of abuse. I want to talk about sexual abuse as a way to illustrate that. And so whether the sexual abuse takes place from an adult to a child, or an adult to a teen, or an adult to another adult, what happens is, first and foremost, the abuser assigns responsibility to that person to meet their demands or their drives. Right? You are responsible to meet, let's take what I think is often the worst case scenario, adult to child. That adult makes the child responsible to respond to sexual drives well outside of the normal psychological and emotional capacity of a child. So that adult makes a young child responsible for their sexual drives. The next thing that happens is they make the child responsible for their choices. And they say things like this: I did this because you're such a bad kid. I did this because you're such a good kid. I did this because you're so pretty. I did this because you're so ugly. And in some way, the abuser assigns responsibility to their victim for their choice to abuse them. I didn't do this because I'm a broken person. I did this because there's something about you that made me do this to you. Now you've got two, and you start to see just how damaging this is. But let's take the leap to the third and then the fourth way that they assign responsibility. The third way they assign responsibility is they then say, you're responsible to keep my secret. Don't tell anybody, or fill in the blank. I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt someone you love. And they may even say, if you tell somebody, I'll end up in jail, which if it's a parent or a family member, then of course the child feels responsible to protect this grown-up from their own behavior. And you can see what's happening is that 5-year-old or 4-year-old or even 3-year-old is feeling the weight of emotional responsibility begin to crush them, because this adult who should have been the one caring for them and should have been the one taking responsibility has dumped these 3 layers of responsibility on them. Now, here's the fourth one, and this is going to be familiar to you and to everybody else who's listening. Let's say that that child works up the courage to tell somebody about it. What's the first question asked? Well, what did you do to make it happen?
Right.
Were
you tempting? What were you wearing? Where were you? Did you jump on their lap?
And now the responsibility moves from not just the abuser assigning responsibility wrongly, but now all of the onlookers, and in most cases, the authorities, whether parental authorities, family authorities, legal authorities, spiritual authorities, they look and they also assign responsibility to the victim. And now you start to see why psychological abuse, I've seen research that says psychological abuse can in most cases be more damaging than physical abuse. And by the way, I think all abuse has a psychological component to it, that specifically that misassignment of responsibility. But what happens is the person not only is harmed by the act of abuse, but they actually take the weight on themselves of feeling responsible for what happened to them and for the protection of the person who did it to them.
So they're sort of victimized 3 times in 3 different ways. It's done to them, then they have to keep it a secret, and it's their responsibility to protect that person from getting into trouble for victimizing them.
And it turns their own mind against them. It's kind of like psychological judo. You know, judo uses the strength of the attacker against them, but abuse turns the mind of the abuse victim against themselves.
And you can see how, if you are naturally a highly loving, kind, and responsible person, this feeds right in that. If you're a victim of this, well, you know, it's part of your kindness to maybe keep a secret, or it's part of your desire to please, to keep a secret, or your now that you've been told it's your responsibility, then you keep the secret.
I know I can trust you to keep this secret for me. It plays, of course, Gretchen, you've been to both reclaims, and so you've heard me say this. People often ask the question, what's wrong with me that I got abused? And I always want to say back to them, no, it's actually something right about you. It's your kindness, it's your goodness, it's your patience, it's your willingness to, to forbear, it's your willingness to forgive. It's all those good things, the good qualities about somebody. And the danger is, we could end up despising the best things about us and embracing the dark things about our abuser.
Mm.
So that's really the final twist of the psychological element of abuse, is we begin to hate our goodness while protecting the badness of someone else.
Wow. What does that look like? What's the mental gymnastics that we go through that cause us to hate our own goodness and protect the abuser?
At some point, let me say it this way. I saw this written down somewhere the other day. It might have been a meme. Today's Encyclopedia Britannica is memes, right? Somebody said, when a child is abused, they don't hate their abuser, they hate themselves.
Mm.
What happens is, and that's not just about a child in many cases, what happens is, because we accept that exchange, you're not responsible, I'm responsible, then a child or a victim of abuse internalizes that blame. And they either grow up, again, starting as a child, they grow up believing that they're responsible for all bad things. Or if this happens to someone later in life, they begin to shift their belief to really genuinely assume, well, it must be me, because they are the preacher, because they are the policeman. They are there's somebody in authority and somebody who should have taken care of me. So it must be me.
Mm. Mm. And once you start blaming yourself, then you will accept more abuse from them and more abuse because it's due to you. They can twist it in a million ways.
And it's one of the ways that this pattern gets transmitted through the generations. Someone learns in childhood that they're responsible to take care of other people. So they marry into a relationship that they need to take care of the spouse. And as they need to take care of the spouse, the children grow up in an environment where they see one person being entirely irresponsible and the other person taking 100% responsibility.
Mm.
And then the kids tend to either become like one or the other, and the next generation repeats the pattern again.
Wow.
So Gretchen,
Wow.
here's how it plays out. And this is, I'm going to try to, I really agonized over, I've been in practice since 1991. I think of myself as an intelligent man. And I think of myself as not just intelligent, but emotionally intelligent, relationally intelligent. And yet I had to look back and go, how was I so fooled? And there's an element of this that's a little bit like the old parable about the frog in hot water, right? That the frog sitting in room temperature water doesn't do anything. And if you heat it slowly, because a frog is cold-blooded, their temperature rises with the water and they don't recognize that they're in trouble and they die.
Mm.
If you just drop a frog in hot water, I'm told they'll jump out quickly and they'll stay safe. I have a friend of mine, actually got her permission because of the writing that I'm still working my way through, but I got her permission to share this story. She married somebody, and the day after they married, he beat her black and blue. There'd been no signs of it in the engagement. There'd been no signs of it throughout their dating. But the day that he married her, the very next day, he beat her physically.
Mm.
And she looked at him and said, if you ever lay a hand on me again, I will leave here and annul this marriage. And he swung at her again and said, you're my wife. I can do what I want. She walked out and annulled the marriage and never went back.
Wow.
She was like a frog dropped in hot water. She went from 0 to 100, and there was no kind of grooming element to it, which is, part of how we end up fooled. So what ends up happening so that we get fooled, how we end up being that frog in the cool water that gets warmed up, is we find ourselves in relationships that, again, play on the better aspects of our nature. We're helpers, and we're compassionate, and we're caring, and we're generous. And when that happens and our partner needs something, we don't hesitate to respond to that need. That's a good thing to do. There are ways that I would say, and I haven't thought this through, so you may X this off this later, edit it out, but there are ways that I would say that the opposite of abuse is mutuality in relationship.
Mm.
Because if abuse is the misassignment of responsibility, mutuality says that we both take responsibility and we both have power in the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is someone gets into a relationship where someone begins to express a need, the other person responds positively to it. But when the second person expresses a need, the other person says, no, I'm not going to respond to your need. And then this escalates over time. So what ends up happening is the abuse victim has what I call resource. They've got emotional resource, in some cases financial resource. In a number of cases, their time and service is resource. And also their body and the availability of their body sexually is a resource. They have something, a resource that their abuser wants.
Mm.
The abuser then has deficits. They've got emotional deficits. They've got psychological deficits. They've got drives that are unfulfilled in their view. And so when those two people are side by side, you've got the unfulfilled deficits over here, and you've got the resource over here. What ends up happening is the abuser starts to ask the victim to carry the deficit.
Mm.
So
Give us an example of that.
He comes home drunk and says, would you call my boss and let him know I can't make it to work?
Ah, got it.
Worse than that, he comes home drunk and says, I only drink because you're such a nag.
Got
And
it.
what he's saying is, I have an addiction, but it's not my addiction, it's yours.
Wow.
My deficit is because of you. But then he also says, you've got resource, would you give it to me? If you would cook more, if you would give me more sex, if you would, and he begins a list of things that he believes that if he probably really believes if that victim would do more or do less of the things on his list or her list, then he believes he won't have the problem anymore. So here's how.
Do you think he really believes that, or does he just want her to believe it? And of course, we've already established early in this video that sometimes it's the man who's the victim of abuse in the relationship. But
I think both, Gretchen. I think that there are those who really believe that their problem is the other person. And I believe that there are those who learn that that's a great strategy to just keep having their way.
Mm. Mm.
The abuser who says, I feel inadequate, I feel insecure, and I think if you would dress up more, lose some weight, I would feel better about myself, whatever it might be. I think there's a part of them that believes that. Now, I've heard other people say, no, it's just 100%. They're intentional about their abuse. I think there's some of both. And probably at the ends of the bell curve, there's some people who are the predatory type abuser who absolutely knows this is just how I manipulate my victim. And at the other end, there's just kind of the dependent addictive type who really does believe the whole rest of the world has to change for them to be okay.
Mm.
But in the middle of the bell curve, I think most of them are kind of mixed, half and half. So here's the way I describe it. I've kind of laid the groundwork then. The victim, as I've said, believes that they're a special helper who's got either special skills or special qualities, that they're the only person who can help their partner. The abuser believes that I have either no problem or a very small problem. My problem is you.
Mm.
And if you would change, my small problem would go away, or this problem that I don't really have, but other people think I do. Other people think I'm angry. Other people think I drink too much. Other people think I'm, look at too much porn. Other people would know that I only have that problem because of the other person. And so when somebody looks at this from the outside, often what happens is an outsider will look and they will believe the narrative of the abuser. Your partner's not loving enough. And if your partner were loving enough, this problem that you have wouldn't be a problem anymore, or you'd be able to solve it. So I did a teaching on this last September at a conference for a group of church leaders. And I told a story that's all too common in church, Gretchen. And I didn't tell them ahead of time. So I'll tell it the way that I told at the conference. Imagine this. I don't know if your religious stream does this thing where at the end of a service, you've got a prayer team that comes down to the altar and people come down to receive prayer, and so they're a group of mature leaders at the front, or at least trained leaders, or whatever it might be. And the whole congregation is allowed to come down and just ask for prayer. And I told them, if you've ever been down front waiting for prayer, and a person comes to you and says, let's say in this case, a man comes to you and says, my wife left me and I didn't even know anything was wrong. She's moved in with friends and she's getting bad counsel from all of her friends. And she never even told me that there was a problem. And I've done everything I can, but I think she's kind of gone off the deep end, and I think she's hanging with bad people, and those bad people got her ear. And so she's kind of joined the bad people. Would you pray with me that she'll come back? Mm-hmm. And, if you've ever done that kind of prayer with people, you've certainly had at least one person come down with that prayer request.
Yeah.
I looked at this room full of church leaders and said, 99% chance that the person that you're praying with is the abuser in that moment.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The people who say, I have no idea why she left me, or I have, she doesn't have biblical grounds for divorce.
I didn't know anything was wrong. She never told me anything was wrong. Of course, when you get with the spouse, they say, I told them for 10 years. They just minimized it and didn't believe it.
Right.
So,
right.
And part of the point of that is that the onlookers then far too often buy the belief system of both the victim who doesn't believe they're a victim, they think they're a special helper, and the abuser who believes that they don't have a problem. Their problem is their spouse, who needs to up their level of generosity, consideration, kindness, sexual availability, service in the household, whatever it is that he or she's demanding. So onlookers kind of naturally fall into that and believe the narrative that's shown to them.
Right. So they don't, it doesn't even occur to them that the story isn't really making sense, and that there's no way somebody could, just walk out and not have ever said anything. And they even ignore what they know of that person. They know that this person, is really a committed believer who really takes their faith seriously. So something's not adding up.
Yeah, you and I both know this is one of the saddest and most heartbreaking elements of this. When it happens in a spiritual community, what you just said is that people who know the person who left just kind of toss aside everything they would have known about them, because they hear this person's story. And the story of that person that person is handing them is a classic presentation of an abuser. They're putting all their minuses, they're putting all their deficits on the reputation of the person who actually has all the resource and all the emotional and spiritual maturity. Yeah. But because they're not present to fight for themselves. See, what happens is an abuse victim at this stage will almost never speak ill of their partner. But an abuser always speaks ill of their partner. Why?
Yeah, I used to say we victims, we fall on our swords because we still want to protect their reputation, because we're their special helper. So we'll fall on our sword and say nothing bad about them.
We're taking all of their deficits as if they are our own. And we're taking our resource, our reputation, our strength, our emotional, emotional strength. We're giving that to them as if it's theirs. So there's a lot of ways that these onlookers, spiritual leaders, counselors, law enforcement, it's not that surprising that they get fooled, because at this stage, both the victim and the abuser are giving essentially the same narrative. Now, I keep saying at this stage, there does come a stage, I think, where the victim, suddenly the scales are peeled off and they see, and at that point, it's almost impossible to keep them from talking about it.
Mm. And then they're told not to gossip or slander. So then they're silenced.
Right.
See this a lot.
Yeah.
So what happens next?
Oh, I guess I said that one is the most insidious, but I think this might be the most insidious, because if what I just described is true, for the abuse dynamic to stop, then those two issues, the special helper and the person who doesn't have a problem, actually looks different for each of them. So here's the thing, for the abuser to change, he or she's got to begin to take responsibility. And what I mean by that is they've got to say, wait, I am the problem. Here's what I've been doing that's harmful. Here's who I've harmed, and here's who I've deceived, and I'm going to do this publicly. Why would it be publicly? Because in many cases, the denigration of their spouse has been public.
Right.
Or if it's been secret, it's kind of risen to the surface publicly as 5 or 6 different people have believed that the victim is actually the bad guy.
Yeah.
So for the abuser to change, they've got to take responsibility. But as we'll talk about another time, in the cycle of abuse, the abuser often has some motivation to give the appearance of change.
Mm.
So here's what they do. They stop the behavior, but they never take responsibility. And all of a sudden they get applause, right? The leaders, the counselors, everybody says, don't you see how much they've changed? Look,
yeah, they're changing. Look, they're going to counseling.
They're not doing this anymore, and they are doing this. And on a behavioral level, they describe what would appear to be change. Gretchen, one of the reasons why I'm so insistent on redefining abuse as the misassignment of responsibility is you can change behaviorally for a season of time, but if you genuinely have changed and the issue is about misassigning responsibility, then you will genuinely begin to accept responsibility in a verbal and visible way.
Okay, so it has to be verbal, has to be visible, it has to be public. And I want to go back to what you said earlier. You need to know what you did, who you did it to, and be upfront about that.
Yeah, what was the impact? Who was influenced? If I turned people against other people, I've got to own that. So that's what it means to take responsibility, is to take responsibility for the whole, everything I've broadcast into the culture.
And that's important because a lot of abusers really get in there and smear the reputation of their own spouse. Yeah. Secretly, covertly, they're saying, well, so-and-so just doesn't get it. Or, I don't think she's going to be able to handle this. Or, she's not really strong in this area. And so they start tearing down the other person in ways so that the church then is pre-primed to believe them, not the victim.
Yeah. I think I've heard it said that if they can't control the victim anymore, then they control the narrative.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And some of them are incredibly good at it because they don't do the direct smear. They do the subtle, I'm worried about them.
Mm.
I've just seen some real signs that they're struggling.
Mm.
They portray it as, or they'll use sympathy for themselves. I've just been hurt so much. And, you see kind of the crocodile tears that good, compassionate leaders or people in ministry will see that and feel compassion. And that misplaced compassion becomes, again, part of the fuel that keeps the abuser in their cycle. But let's catch the second half of change. Remember, I said for the abuser to change, they have to take responsibility. Here's the part that really jacks with Christian leaders and Christian counselors, and why it's crucial to get this idea of responsibility locked in our mind. For the abuse victim to change, they have to cease taking responsibility, and they have to give responsibility back to the one that it belongs to.
The victim needs to stop taking that responsibility, hand it right back to the abuser. And this is yours, not mine.
That's when the outsiders say, wow, you're bitter. And what appears the healthiest thing for an abuse victim to do, if people misunderstand abuse as a behavioral issue instead of a responsibility issue, when the victim does the healthiest thing possible, then the onlookers think that they're doing something unhealthy. They think they're blaming. They think they're vindictive. They think they're gossiping. And what they're really doing is saying, hey, this thing that I've been carrying actually belongs to this person over here, and I'm going to stop carrying it, which might actually mean that I move out. It might mean that I separate. It might mean that I divorce.
Right.
And all of those steps to an onlooker looks like they view that as, well, wait a minute, he changed his behavior. She changed her behavior. Why are you being so vindictive? Why are you giving up so early? And it's all about the failure to recognize that responsibility is the key dynamic.
Oh, and what you just said there, the concept of, doesn't she see that I'm changing? You're giving up so early. I'm really, really trying. I
Yeah.
mean, what do you say?
And that's part of the sympathy that I mentioned a minute ago. They'll really play up the sympathy of their counselor. There are counselors who fall into this trap all the time.
Yeah.
I did for a long time. Um, yeah, I'm going to tell this story just because it was on my mind the other day. I actually, probably 9 years ago, I don't remember exactly when it was, about 9 years ago. No, it had to be longer than that because I was still, so wow, maybe 15 years ago. One way or another, I actually used to teach this, Gretchen, and I'm just going to confess it. I used to teach this phrase: abuse victims know how to get abused.
Ooh,
And
ooh.
now I no longer believe that nor teach that. But here's why I believe that. I sat in front of an abusive marriage and I misidentified the abuser and the victim.
Wow.
I watched a wife scream at her husband and say, "You want to hit me? Go ahead, hit me." And she was physically provocative. She was verbally provocative. She was emotionally provocative. And she was doing everything she could to provoke him to be violent in front of me.
Mm.
And I thought, well, if he hits her, she got him to.
Right.
Today, I now realize she was the abuser. She was placing all the responsibility for their conflict on him. But if I just would look through my eyes, I could see all of her. If you turn down the sound and stop listening to words and just look at the behavior, you see process instead of content, and process almost never lies.
So how did you figure out that she was the abuser?
Honestly, hindsight.
Mm.
At the time, I didn't know it. At the time, I was the bad counselor.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
It's hindsight where I look back, because I remember that moment because I used to teach off of that moment, that thing that I said a minute ago about abusers know how to get abused, or abuse victims know how to get abused. Looking back through my newfound understanding that came through my own experience, I now realize, she was literally putting all the emotional weight on him.
Mm.
But at the
Mm.
time, I thought, wow, this violent guy, and no wonder she's been provoked to this level of anxiety and anger at him.
Mm. Mm.
It, it,
It's interesting because as a ministry, leader myself for almost 20, well, more than 20 years, I get conned too. And so I'm always a little bit sympathetic to ministry leaders because we don't actually know what's going on behind closed doors. We don't have that, that intimate knowledge of what's going on in that marriage. And it's easy to fall for a really good, a really good acting job. And I too, and there are also people who've just never been given the opportunity to misbehave. And so you might know them for a few years and they seem just fine, and they get put into a new level of responsibility, and suddenly they're ripping everyone off. And I think that I do have a lot of compassion for ministry people, because sometimes, well, frankly, we all get conned from time to time.
we do. And it's one of the things. I'll tell you two things that I've started doing. One of the things I've started doing is I send them for testing.
Oh, really? Okay. Tell us about that.
I have a person here locally who administers the MCMI, the Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory. It's a personality inventory, and it's one of the it's right up there with the MMPI in terms of just kind of the effectiveness of this test. But it also tests not just personality style, but literally it tests against the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So it's looking for personality disorders.
Wow. Let me ask you something about that, because I did a lot of employment testing, in my job. I occasionally ran across a real egotistical person who said, I knew exactly how to answer that. And so, I just faked my way through that test. Are these tests pretty easy to game?
Uh, you know, some of the tests that are used for employment are a bit easier to game.
Hmm.
One of the reasons I like the MCMI or the MMPI is because they've been normed for decades now. I couldn't tell you how far they go back, but I know that in grad school, we worked with both of those tests. And that was in the 90s. That was in the late 80s, early 90s, just to give you a sense of, I know I don't look that old, I'm sure, but but what that means is that both of them have subscales that are designed to catch deception. They have what's called the faking good or faking bad. In other words, because there's several times the same question is asked in slightly different language, and then the test itself will indicate this person's trying to look better than they are, or this person's trying to look worse than they are. And then they adjust the results based on those faking good or faking bad scales.
Well, thank you. I wanted to know that. So you might often now send them out to get testing.
Yeah.
And then what?
So I've got a pretty good thing going with this guy who does the testing. I just, ethically speaking, a psychological test needs to be interpreted by a clinical professional. And he's willing to let me do the interpretation. So he just sends the write-up over to me, and I look at it, and it helps me know if I'm being fooled. And then the second step of that is I do an interpretation with the test subjects. If they'll give me permission, I'll do it with the marriage present. So I'll sit down with both of them present, and we'll go over their testing scores together and say, here are some things you need to know about yourself. And it's several different times it's helped me not get fooled. The second thing I was going to say is that there is this dynamic, and I think we mentioned it a while ago before we jumped on to the recording. There is this dynamic where sometimes the victim asks the question, am I the abuser?
Right. Yes.
And quite honestly, in family therapy terms, there's a dynamic called conflictually enmeshed. Conflictually enmeshed is that kind of an enmeshed couple with no boundaries and high conflict. And what ends up happening is that exchange of resource and deficit goes both ways. There's blame that goes both ways. There's codependency that goes both ways. And in that particular kind of dynamic, there really can be kind of a mutually abusive dynamic if we go simply by my definition of responsibility. Now, one might be an addict and the other a codependent. One might be a physical abuser, the other a physical victim. But there can be emotional abuse that goes both directions, and that's called conflictually enmeshed. So it helps, again, the testing helps me identify and it helps me present to the couples, hey, there's something going on. You've presented all this time like you're the suffering victim. Let's take a look at what your test says. Let's take a look at what their test says, lay them side by side and see if we can't really just, rather than assign blame, let's diagnose this in a way that can produce change.
And so when you do this, it seems to me that your goal is to get each of them to be responsible for their own behavior, their own attitudes, and their own actions. How do you move them into that situation?
That's a great question. I partly want to answer and say, I wish I knew the answer to that. But let me give some solid answers to that. At the core of emotional health is this developmental process called individuation. And the way I describe it is the movement from dependence to independence, emotional dependence to emotional independence. And we typically think of dependence versus independence as a financial thing. I'm paying my own bills. I'm paying for my car. I'm putting gas in my car, paying my insurance. I'm financially independent. But emotional dependence is really another clinical way to describe what I talked about when I said the misassignment of responsibility. Emotional dependence means that somebody has not emotionally developed to the point where they recognize that they can impact their own world. And so they tend to believe, or they wholeheartedly believe, that the world has to change for them to be happy, satisfied, for them to be okay with life. Emotional independence, which is really the family's job to produce emotional independence. Emotional independence comes from somebody facing difficult situations, owning it, and facing it head on and solving their own problems. And families who don't let their children solve their own problems create emotional dependence.
So these are the kids where They blow off their homework, or and so mom has them stay home from the test, knowing that they're going to fail the test, and she sits with them and does their homework and does the flashcards with them and begs the teacher, please give Johnny a chance to take this test over. He was so sick, and does that kind of thing.
Think about what you just described in terms of deficit and resource. Mom has resource. Johnny has a deficit, and school is designed to strengthen him to the point that that deficit goes away. But if instead she carries his deficit, I'll let you stay home sick, I'll do the flashcards. She gives her resource, I'll work harder at your school than you do. And the dynamic of the misassignment of responsibility began right there.
Wow.
And that's why I say it's the family of origin that either fosters emotional dependence or fosters emotional independence. Therapeutically, there's degrees of this. And people who have a modicum of independence, it's much easier to help them move down the continuum. Whereas you've got someone who's wholeheartedly still emotionally dependent, they're likely to blame you, or if you tell them that they need to change, they feel criticized. Right? So you've heard that about abusers or from abusers. If you tell them you have a need, they feel criticized. If you tell them you want some change so that you can meet as mutually in a relationship, they feel criticized. And if a counselor says, hey, there's a need for change, they feel criticized. There's the old saying, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? And there's only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change.
Exactly. And so how do we wrap this up? We've got the abuser. You've just described them as a person who just feels threatened every time they're criticized, and they won't take it in, so they probably won't change. And you have this victim who may think that they have abusive traits. What happens there? We can only fix ourselves. So what recommendation do you have for them?
You just gave the most important advice right there, and that is we can only fix ourselves. Because the abuse victim has so invested in fixing the other, it almost feels like a betrayal for them to pay attention to their own needs. And yet, in an abuse dynamic, when I'm counseling a marriage where I see the abuse dynamic and it has come clear to me, I will, it's important to maintain agency. It's important that you continue to give them the freedom to make choices, because the abuse dynamic itself is to some degree built on the absence of choices. And so what I would never do is tell somebody, you need to leave, you should leave. What I will tell people is, let's talk about what's happening here. And I think back to some degree about my own experience, and I simply try to ask questions that will allow the scales to fall off. Honestly, Gretchen, the thing that has helped the most is the teaching that I just did for you about the exchange of resource and deficit. I draw two circles with pluses and minuses, and I put it in front of them, and I show them. I say, this is the definition of abuse. And that seems to have opened more eyes than anything I've ever been able to say or get them to read.
Wow.
Then the next step is, what do they do? And remember what we said is the abuser would have to take responsibility. The abuse victim would have to begin to withdraw their support of responsibility. And so you prepare them. What does that look like? Well, you're going to be blamed because you've been accepting responsibility all this time. You have to prepare that if you really withdraw your responsibility taking, then both your partner is going to blame you and probably some other people are going to blame you. So let's prepare you for that. And
that's so important to prepare them for it. Let's wrap this up. Yep. Any final comments on the topic of dynamics of abuse?
Yeah. I want to say the thing I said a couple minutes ago. I almost always start our conferences by talking about if you are being abused or have been abused, it's not because of something wrong with you. It's because of something incredibly right with you. You bring emotional strength. You bring spiritual and personal resource to the world. And everybody has benefited from that but you.
Mm.
And if you want to give that resource to more people, then you've got to learn to get yourself free first. In other words, take the time to really care for yourself. And if you have the strength to stay in an abusive relationship, then you definitely have the strength to leave it.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Bob. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Yeah. Thanks, Gretchen.